Okay, let's jump into this deep dive on U.S. China relations. It's a story with so many twists and turns.
Absolutely. And a really dramatic starting point is the Korean War.
Right. People often think of it just in terms of Korea, but our sources really highlight it as this moment of direct military clash between the U.S. and the newly formed PRC.
And it didn't just stop there. Even after the fighting, the U.S. was involved in supporting nationalist Chinese forces who'd fled to Burma.
Yeah, that's a fascinating detail. The idea was what? To keep pressure on China? Distract them.
Exactly. To divert PRC resources, keep them looking over their shoulder, away from Korea. It really shows how confrontational the relationship was from the absolute beginning.
And you have to see it from Mao's perspective too, right? This perceived American expansion in Asia.
Oh, definitely. For the new PRC, American power moving closer felt like an existential threat. That, plus the war literally on their border, pushed them to intervene, even though the U.S., well, seemed to downplay the warnings.
So it wasn't just about Korea itself, it was about spheres of influence, about regional power.
Right.
And this initial conflict, this hostility, it just froze things solid for decades, didn't it? From 49 right through to the early 70s.
Literally frozen. Constant propaganda battles, deep suspicion.
I mean, think about that story from the 1954 Geneva Conference. Secretary of State Dulles just refusing to shake Zhu Enlai's hand.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It shows the complete lack of diplomatic bridges.
And the official U.S. policy backed that up. No recognition of the PRC.
Right. All official ties were with the ROC, Taiwan, and the U.S. actively worked to keep the PRC out of the UN.
Plus a trade embargo. Beijing must have felt incredibly isolated.
Isolated and, frankly, targeted. The fact that the ROC held the UN Security Council seat and the veto power that came with it was a major tool in that strategy.
And our sources say things actually got worse under Kennedy initially.
Yeah, the tension deepened. But then there's this interesting bit about the Sino-Soviet split. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Washington wasn't entirely sure where that was heading.
Ah, right. So what clarified it for them?
Well, two things mainly. The Sino-Indian border war and how Beijing reacted to the Cuban Missile Crisis itself.
How so?
It led the U.S. policy folks to conclude that maybe China was actually more militant, more ideologically driven than the Soviet Union at that point.
Which is counterintuitive in some ways?
It was. But that perception made the idea of improving relations with Moscow seem more appealing, potentially as a way to balance China.
Fascinating strategic calculation. Okay, so then, boom, 1972, Nixon goes to China. Everything changes.
A complete sea change, just massive.
Our sources call it a huge turning point, but it wasn't smooth sailing internally in China, was it?
Not at all. There was significant opposition. Lin Biao, Mao's designated successor at the time, supposedly led the resistance.
Yeah.
And then his death in that plane crash. Still very mysterious.
Yeah, that adds another layer of intrigue. What about the rest of the world? How did they react?
Oh, it was all over the map. The Soviets were deeply suspicious, naturally. Romania praised it.
And the hardliners?
Cuba, Albania, North Vietnam, they condemned it, called it capitulationism by China. Interestingly, North Korea flipped the script and claimed it was the U.S. capitulating.
Always a different angle. So this thaw leads eventually to 1979, formal diplomatic relations.
That's the milestone. The U.S. formally recognizes the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China.
But, and it's a big but, we keep unofficial ties with Taiwan through the Taiwan Relations Act.
Exactly. And that piece of U.S. law committed the U.S. to help Taiwan defend itself, providing arms. That's been a major sticking point ever since.
Deng Xiaoping apparently saw it as the U.S. being insincere,
Right.
undermining the whole normalization deal.
That's what the sources suggest. He felt it contradicted the spirit of the agreements they'd made.
Okay, so we move into the 80s and 90s. Normalization is happening, maybe some nascent cooperation.
Yeah, things stabilized somewhat. President Ford visited in '75. Carter reaffirmed the Shanghai Communique, which led to those '79 relations.
And there was that 1982 joint communique, the U.S. saying it would gradually reduce arms sales to Taiwan.
Yes, and in the same document, the PRC stated its policy was striving for a peaceful resolution on Taiwan, though obviously the interpretation and follow-through on both sides have been debated ever since.
Then in the 90s, we see more high-level visits. Jiang Zemin comes to the U.S. in 97.
That was significant, the first state visit by a PRC paramount leader since '79. They even reached an agreement on peaceful nuclear cooperation.
And Clinton went to China in 98. I remember that being quite a big deal, his interactions with ordinary people.
It was. And he stated the three no's policy regarding Taiwan while he was in Shanghai. But he also faced criticism back home and internationally about China's human rights situation.
Right, that tension is always there. Okay, early 2000s, things get a bit cold, cloak and dagger. Listening devices found on Jiang Zemin's plane.
Yeah, his U.S.-built presidential plane, reportedly, that certainly didn't help build trust, did it?
Not exactly, but at the same time, the economic relationship was just exploding.
Absolutely. The mid-2000s saw this incredible growth in interdependence, U.S. consumers getting cheaper goods,
And China becoming the biggest foreign holder of U.S. debt.
which creates this really complex dynamic. Deep economic ties, but underlying strategic mistrust. And the U.S. focus, arguably, shifted a bit away from China during the height of the War on Terror years.
Then we get to the Obama era. Seems like a real mix. On one hand, loads of agreements, especially on climate change.
Yeah, the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center, C, for example. Our sources suggest those technical exchanges on things like emissions did actually build some trust in that specific area.
A sort of safe harbor for cooperation.
Perhaps. But other tensions were definitely brewing. China wasn't happy about the Buy American stuff in the U.S. stimulus after the 2008 crash.
And wasn't there talk of a G2 or Chimerica, this idea of the two giants running things?
There was definitely that discussion in some U.S. political circles, reflecting just how intertwined the economies had become. The formal dialogue structure also evolved. The strategic economic dialogue became the broader U.S. China strategic and economic dialogue.
And they even managed some cooperation on North Korea sanctions in 2013.
A rare moment of alignment on that front.
Then the Sunnyland Summit in 2013, Obama and Xi Jinping. That was billed as a really big deal.
It was positioned as maybe the most significant meeting since Nixon and Mao. They reached agreements on climate again, and North Korea, too.
But the tough issues remain.
Oh, yeah. Cyber espionage was a huge one. U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, another. Deep divisions there.
Though Obama did stick to the one China policy line.
Consistently. And in 2014, he explicitly said the U.S. saw Tibet as part of the PRC, didn't support independence.
But even with all that diplomacy, military friction was increasing, wasn't it, in the South China Sea?
Definitely. The PLA Air Force started patrols there in 2015. The U.S. refused to recognize China's declared ADIZ Air Defense Identification Zone.
Right, where they expect foreign planes to identify themselves.
And Secretary of Defense Ash Carter warned China quite pointedly about its island-building activities. You could feel the strategic tension ratcheting up beneath the surface.
It seemed like the different interpretations of international law, especially at sea, were becoming harder to ignore.
Exactly. Plus, growing U.S. concern about China's military buildup.
Okay, fast forward to the Trump administration. Suddenly the tone shifts dramatically.
Oh, completely. China becomes priority number one. And you see appointments like Rubio and Waltz in the second term, plans known China hardliners. It signaled a much more confrontational approach.
Though interestingly, there were still some high-level contacts happening right before the second inauguration. Pence, Elon Musk, meeting with China's Vice President Han Zheng.
Yeah, suggesting Beijing still wanted to keep some lines open, perhaps gauge the new landscape.
But the public rhetoric was tough from the start. Spicer talking about defending international territories in the South China Sea.
And Defense Secretary Mattis very clearly reaffirming the U.S. commitment to defending Japan, explicitly including the Senkaku Islands.
Which China also claimed, of course, the Diaoyu Islands.
Right. Then the Meng Wanzhou arrest in Canada, the Huawei CFO. That was a major escalation.
The U.S. citing national security concerns about Huawei.
Exactly. It really fueled this narrative in the U.S. of China as an antagonist, a rival challenging the whole U.S.-led order.
And we saw the government really tighten scrutiny on Chinese investments in U.S. tech.
A big focus on preventing sensitive technology transfer. Even former Obama officials started speaking out more critically about China's trade practices, the Meng case, Hong Kong.
And the DOJ launched that China initiative.
Aimed at economic espionage, though it became controversial and was eventually ended in 2023 amid concerns about profiling.
There was also that comment from Kyron Stinner at the State Department about this competition being different because China wasn't within the Western family.
That sparked a lot of debate. And you saw groups like the Committee on the Present Danger, China pushing for a much harder line.
It's also striking how domestic events got pulled into the narrative. Chinese state media jumping on the George Floyd protests.
Yeah, comparing them to Hong Kong, framing it as U.S. hypocrisy, and then that Axios story about alleged Chinese political espionage, Christine Fang.
It just shows how the information space became another battleground.
Absolutely. Both sides trying to shape perceptions, highlight the other's flaws.
Towards the end of that administration, the State Department tweaked its language on Taiwan again, didn't it?
Subtly, yes. They removed the part explicitly acknowledging China's sovereignty claims over Taiwan from their fact sheet. Still didn't support independence, but it was a noticeable shift.
Signaling less deference to Beijing's specific wording on the One China policy.
Precisely. A small but significant indicator.
And the friction just kept building. The spy balloon incident in 2023 really brought things into sharp focus.
That whole episode flying across the U.S. being shot down, it just amplified all the existing fears about Chinese espionage and national security threats.
And it came after years of reports about major cyber attacks,
Yeah.
OPM, Anthem, Marriott, alleged theft of F-35 plans.
Right. So the balloon wasn't seen in isolation. It landed in fertile ground for suspicion.
And the response has been more concrete actions, like export controls on key technologies.
Yeah, the U.S. and allies trying to slow China's military and tech progress. The Biden administration talking a lot about supply chain independence, moving away from reliance on China in critical areas.
We saw the Commerce Department block tech sales to specific Chinese aerospace firms.
And then late 2024, reports of another major hack, this time targeting the U.S. Treasury, blamed on Chinese state actors.
And that Reuters report alleging a U.S. propaganda campaign against China's Sinovac vaccine. That adds another really complex and potentially risky dimension.
If true, that's moving into active information warfare, trying to undermine a major Chinese product during a global health crisis. It's a serious escalation.
So looking back, the sources paint this picture of stability punctuated by conflict tactile. Korea, Vietnam.
Yeah, it's cyclical in a way. Periods of trying to manage the relationship, then periods of open friction.
There are shared interests, climate change, non-proliferation, you hear those mentioned.
True, but they often get overshadowed by the persistent disagreements. Human rights in China, Taiwan status, the One China policy interpretations.
And the economic ties, while deep, are also a source of friction. China holding U.S. debt, but also trade imbalances, intellectual property issues.
And now, increasingly, direct competition. The U.S. pushing back against China in the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea disputes.
China's growing military budget is obviously a huge factor in U.S. calculations.
A potential challenge to decades of U.S. dominance in the region, although you sometimes get mixed signals from the U.S. about military-to-military talks.
People sometimes talk about power transition theory. A rising power challenging the established one often leads to conflict. Does that fit here?
It's debated. Some see clear parallels. Others think the economic interdependence makes it fundamentally different from past examples. But the potential for miscalculation is certainly there.
And Taiwan just seems central to so much of it. That U.S. commitment to provide defensive arms.
While sticking to the One China policy framework, Beijing sees that as fundamentally contradictory, as we discussed, a sign of U.S. insincerity going back decades.
The competition plays out everywhere, doesn't it? East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Belt and Road versus TPP, even if the U.S. pulled out of TPP.
AIB, regional infrastructure projects, even seemingly small things like the Wakjar Pass border crossing with Afghanistan remaining closed, it's all part of the chessboard.
And you see countries in the region reacting. ASEAN nations wanting closer ties with the U.S. because of China's actions at sea.
Right, China's assertiveness pushes some neighbors towards the U.S., and the U.S. is definitely strengthening ties with China's rivals, like India.
How does China view all this? The U.S. pivot, the TTP attempt, the trade war.
Largely as a containment strategy. A breach of trust, undermining China's rise. That narrative is very strong in Beijing.
And then there's the whole cyber dimension. It feels relentless. Alleged interference going back to the 90s, the OPM hack.
Concerns about influencing U.S. elections, the alleged CIA social media campaign against Xi, phishing attacks, TikTok security worries, that Treasury hack again. It's a constant low-level, and sometimes not so low-level, conflict in cyberspace.
It really blurs the lines, doesn't it?
Completely. Between espionage, influence, and outright attack.
Climate change seemed like the one area they could consistently talk.
For a while, yes. John Kerry pushed hard on that, leading to the Sunnyland Statement in late 2023, a specific agreement to cooperate more.
But even that's getting complicated now, with the new rules on AI chips.
Exactly. March 2024, the Biden administration tightens rules on AI chip access for China. Then reports that China might ban exports of some semiconductor manufacturing gear to the U.S.
So even climate tech gets caught up in the bigger fight over high-tech dominance and decoupling.
It seems almost unavoidable now. The competition is seeping into nearly every domain.
We have economists like Sheng Hong pointing out the basic incompatibility between China's state capitalism and free market ideals.
And reports of China censoring domestic news about the trade war, making it hard to gauge internal debate.
Professor Lawrence Lau sees it driven by this techno-economic battle, plus rising populism globally.
While the Global Times in China spins it as making the country stronger, more confident. Very different framing.
Priya Basu notes the historical irony developed countries used to push developing ones to open up. Now it's almost reversed in some ways.
And you have analysts like Hillman and Bown saying the U.S. needs a coalition to confront China effectively, while others like Michael Wessel are skeptical about foreign firms' roles in China's tech rise.
Even tariffs on medical gear during COVID became political dynamite.
Hugely complicated.
Right.
And polls show U.S. public opinion on tariffs is split along party lines.
Then reports early this year, Trump ordering CFIUS to restrict Chinese investment more. China's premier calling relations at an important juncture in a meeting with a pro-Trump senator. It feels like we're constantly on edge.
Important juncture seems like a very apt description. There's a real sense of flux and uncertainty about where things head next.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the picture that emerges is just incredibly complex cycles of conflict and cooperation.
Driven by geopolitics, economics, ideology, always shifting.
With Taiwan as a constant flashpoint, and now this intense tech competition layered on top.
And understanding that history, all those twists and turns we've talked about, is just crucial if you want to make sense of what's happening now and what might happen next.
Because their relationship impacts literally everyone, everywhere.
No question. It's arguably the defining relationship for the 21st century.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you with. Considering this long, tangled history of cooperation, competition, and outright conflict, what do you think could be the most unexpected factor, the real wild card, that might fundamentally reshape U.S.-China relations in the next 10 years? Something to ponder.